Hello, creeps. This is Peter Lorre, and tonight we have a guest appearance of our friend, the Shadow, one of the most fascinating characters in the business of crime detection. He's the man who is always getting shot in his invisibility.
What evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows.
Sorry to interrupt, boys.
The Shadow.
Yes, the Shadow.
Out over the cold hills to the state's prison.
Shadow comes for revenge.
The computer's going to tell us who the Shadow is.
The Shadow knows.
Surely you're not afraid of death.
Crime does not pay. The Shadow knows.
Agents of the Shadowcast report for the only podcast on the internet exclusively devoted to the immortal exploits of the Dark Avenger of the Pulps and old-time radio, The Shadow. It's a very special edition of today's podcast, not least of which because we are not alone, in the immortal words of Michael Jackson. We are joined by a compatriot in pulpdom, a man who has made a significant mark, not just in the field of... is there a field called Shadow History? I don't know, but Shadow History, pulpiteering, whatever you like to call it. I am joined today by the incomparable Will Murray. I can't thank you enough for joining me here.
Oh, I'm happy to do it, Razor.
We're 2 seasons deep. We're actually towards the tail end of season 2 now, and each season is themed. The first one was The Birth of a Dark Legend. We were talking about prominent firsts in the history of the Shadow. First pulp story, first movie, The Shadow Strikes, that fantastic movie. And, we went down all the prominent firsts, good and bad, right? So we had some bad reviews in there and some good ones. This season, it's the Pulp Avenger, and we're going through the first several pulp exploits, really in chronological order. And we just finished the Death Tower. We've now gotten to the Silent Seven. You have a history with, were you technically a co-publisher with Anthony Tollin? I know you contributed a lot to the Pulp.
Publisher, but when he got the rights, he first got the rights to the Shadow, and then he got shortly thereafter the rights to Doc Savage. He asked me to write the background material, what I developed into the intermissions and the interludes.
Yes.
We came up with interludes for the Shadow because that sounded more Shadow-esque.
Right.
And we came up with intermissions for Doc Savage because that was more, film, serial film kind of flavor to
yes.
that word.
Oh, man.
So, in terms of picking the stories, Tony and I, basically conferred over every book because it was funny. I had read most of the Shadow novels, not all, but most of them more or less in the 70s into the 80s. And Tony had a full collection, but he was still working his way through it. Right. So even though I don't have the greatest memory in the world, I kind of had a feel for, the stories. And sometimes, when we were always trying to figure out pairings. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they would be easy and sometimes they would be hard. And there were a lot of logistics.
Right.
There were some stories that paralleled each other. We didn't want them in the same book. There were themes, there were counter themes. And so we would get on the phone and try to figure out 2 or 3 or 4 of them in a row. And often we would set our schedule and later tear it apart because we discovered we paired 2 stories we shouldn't have.
Right.
Or there was some production issue with something. And so, virtually every Shadow reprint that Tony edited and published, I was sort of a co-editor. I think I have a technical title that he gave me after a while. He asked me if I wanted to be contributing editor or consulting editor, and I can't remember what I picked. But basically, we were partnered in the creative part of it, but it was his enterprise, which originally, when he was partnered with Nostalgia Ventures, he had a co-publisher. Eventually, he went off on his own.
Right, exactly. I did notice that as it went on, it slightly changed. There were some slight visual tweaks over time, and of course there was the price adjustment. I mean, for crying out loud, you were publishing them for so long. If they didn't keep pace with inflation, I'd be alarmed. But yeah, so you wrote a lot of those interludes. In fact, there's a really good one in. So we're finally to a story called The Silent Seven. Do you have any thought? You said you don't have the best memory with regard to these stories. Before we move on, because I'm going to be, after we're done with the interview, I'm going to be reviewing The Silent Seven as part of this episode. Do you have any thoughts on this particular story and how, I believe it's kind of a companion piece to The Death Tower. It's almost a continuation.
It is, and I think it doesn't quite reconcile, which may be editorial interference and not Walter Gibson's failing. And I just remember reading the second one and seeing it didn't quite line up, and I don't remember the specifics.
It was a guy. You know what? I think it's the recurring character. There was no recurring character from the previous. They revealed, what was it? It was a cop. That's right. There was a police officer who was revealed to be a member of the Silent Seven and the Faithful 50, and they revealed that at the end of the Death Tower, and then they never showed up in the Silent Seven, so they never were brought to justice.
Okay, well, I'm inclined, because I know that I think that was still when Lon Murray was sort of the official editor who didn't do very much. John Nanovic was line editing. There may have been issues of interference with the story, because I know there's one early issue where the Shadow is described as wearing a monk's hood. It's a passing reference, but Walter didn't do that, I'm sure.
Right.
That was Murray or somebody wanting to make the Shadow resemble the publicity photos of James Lacurto as the Shadow, who wore a monk's hood.
He did, yeah, in some of those promo photos, and is it correct? They modeled the little, for the first several issues, because we're going through the first several. We're probably going to stop in a couple of issues from now. But they used to include in the corner a little illustration of basically James Lacurto in a hood. That was him, correct?
Yeah. They were trying, I guess, to make sure the casual newsstand reader understood this was the Shadow of the radio, even if he wasn't depicted in the same hood.
Yes.
I think there was a struggle of some kind between the radio interpretation, which on the radio show he didn't wear a hood. He was a narrator. He was a bodiless being, the voice of conscience. So they did publicity pictures because they had to kind of create a mystique around what he looked like. So when Walter took that voice, that narrator, and tried to give it life, his thinking was a cloak and a hat. But mostly he was in disguise, as you know, in the early stories.
Right.
So even the cloak and the hat weren't overused. So I think there was some struggle of what he looked like, but the Pulp magazine won out.
Yeah. And I seem to remember, I had heard for the longest time, it's a contrivance that he had the crimson lining in the cloak and whatever. There's a whole bugaboo about the crimson lining in the cape among the Shadow community, as it were. And I'm reading, I think it was Gangdom's Doom, and it described it clearly. And I was like, well, that kind of countervails against that. But yeah,
well,
it's a good. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Except, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I love interrupting people.
Yes, me too.
When the thought comes to my mind, I gotta expound or lose it.
Please do interrupt, because I'm the same exact way.
Just as that monk's description in one of the later stories, I think it might have been the Crime Cult, is clearly an editor, penciling that in. To try to homogenize the two versions of the Shadow. I would suspect the red lining was added editorially.
Yeah, that's entirely possible. Yeah, absolutely. Although, man, with the turnaround on some of these, you imagine they wouldn't have had too much time to sit there with the red pencil, because at a certain point, this thing goes bi-monthly, right?
Yeah.
And so, gosh.
In the Pulp magazine schedules, even when the Shadow was twice a month, these stories got multiple readings. You know, there was Nanovic would do the first reading, and a copy editor would take it over, and then various people would read the galleys, and things could be changed in the galleys even with the tight schedule, because once they got into a groove and they understood the Shadow would be around for a while, they could, and they did, create backlog. And it's not as if there weren't mistakes made from hastiness or oversight or deadline pressure. But I remember Nanovic saying the good thing about the magazines, he edited for his publisher since they were financed well enough that you could be sure even Depression, the Shadow would be published. You know, the Christmas issue, the Shadow would definitely come out, even if it was only April of that year. He said, you know, if you wanted to, you could assemble your Christmas issue in the spring or summer, put it aside, and it was ready to go when you got around to it. So there was a certain amount of luxury in terms of pre-planning and stuff. Though I suspect the covers were painted pretty close to deadline, you know, because sometimes they did accidental cover swaps. Yeah. And there are a few covers that are clearly either generic or painted for a different issue that somehow got on another issue. I think it was Isle of Doom, which is pretty much set in the Mississippi Delta. On the cover, the Shadow is putting the pins in a map of New York City, Lower Manhattan. And I'm thinking, okay, that was not painted for this issue. Was it generically painted, or was it meant for another issue and it ended up on this issue?
That kind of stuff I find really, really fascinating. You mentioned the covers, and I was, you know, I was boning up more on the book because I had already read it a little while ago. I was rereading a particular passage where Walter Gibson, I think this is maybe in the interview, which, correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't this originally in Duende?
Yeah, the first interview in that book, Master of Mystery, was in Duende. The second interview was in the Duende History of the Shadow magazine, which was a 1980 book.
Okay, yeah, and he talked about how he came up with the concept of they used to put yellow bands on some magazines. Yeah. There was like a prestige thing, and they didn't really have the budget to put one on the Shadow. So he's like, why don't you just paint it across, and then we'll call the story the Yellow Band. Yeah,
he was always doing stuff like that. He liked to be involved in the total process to the degree he could. So he was in even though he's a freelancer, he was kind of a company man in the sense that he just didn't turn in his manuscript and ask for his check and go home and write another Shadow. Right. These guys socialized. The editors and the writers socialized, and they would blue sky ideas. Mm-hmm. I think Nanovic once said, we came up with a lot of gadgets and ideas that we didn't follow through in because either they didn't fit or we didn't think they were strong enough. And it's like, I'd like to know some of those ideas,
Right. And it's interesting. He kept, I vaguely recall reading that Walter B. Gibson kept kind of a filofax of characters. When he would create a character, he would kind of give them an index card, and they'd have a status of whether they were alive or not, or something to that effect.
He did that until 1934, when he realized the Shadow was basically killing off, directly or indirectly, most of the villains.
Right.
Like, well, I don't need to keep track of them, and he found that maybe it wasn't that important to keep track of that. Lester Dent did the same thing on Doc Savage. He would write a page or two of summary of a novel once he was finished, and he stopped it after about a year because I guess the deadline pressures on the one hand, but on the other hand, they weren't proving to be very useful because Doc Savage didn't fight recurring characters.
Right. His stories were more standalone, and you have You now have a history, an established history with the Shadow. Somehow you managed to put somebody in Condé Nast in a headlock long enough to get them to let you write some Doc Savage stuff. But the story of the nascence of that project is fascinating to me. Is it true? So first off, I want to make sure that I plug these books properly. One is The Sinister Shadow, and the other is Empire of Doom, and they're both crossovers with the Shadow. I'm talking about the Shadow crossovers now.
Right.
And from what I understand, these are from existing outlines from either Lester Dent or Gibson. What exactly was that story?
Well, it's a funny story. Years ago, when I was doing Doc Savage for Bantam books before my current cycle of Doc Savage novels, I had this dream of doing a crossover between the Shadow and Doc Savage, and my thought was to bring back an early villain who was not properly disposed of. He wasn't a great villain, but he was from the prototypal era of the Shadow.
Right.
And Bantam, folded the Doc Savage series before I could get around to it. And I don't remember if I came across the outline before I wrote The Sinister Shadow or possibly after, because I returned to the idea, and I'm pretty sure I didn't remember distinctly what I was going to do originally, but I do remember wanting to bring back this one character. And when I got the rights to the Shadow, to do a Shadow crossover, the first one, I reached out to the Lester Dent collection at the Western Historical Manuscript collection at I don't think it's at the University of Missouri now. It might still be, I'm not sure. And I wanted to look at the Golden Vulture manuscript, which Lester had written in 1932 before starting Doc Savage. He'd written a Shadow novel, and they sat on it for about 7 years. And Walter was given it at one point, and he revised it, trimming quite a bit. And I knew there had been a 3-chapter false start that I thought I could use for my book. And when I asked for the manuscript, the photocopy of the carbon that Dent had kept all those years, I was shocked to discover I'd gotten a completely different version than the one Walter was given.
Interesting.
And I said, holy hell, there's another version of this. Now, it's the same villain. It's a lot of the same stuff, but there were like 22 chapters that were different, and they were action chapters for the most part.
Nice.
And I said, wow, this is very interesting, because Dent had the Shadow using primitive gadgets, not more sophisticated gadgets such as Doc Savage used, but, interesting implements that never showed up in Doc Savage or the Shadow. And I said, I think some of these could fit into this book. So I usually write by the seat of my pants, and I started writing the book, I think with the Walter Gibson chapters that they had originally rejected that weren't part of either of the drafts that followed. And I started putting in these chapters, rewriting them as necessary, and I discovered I could use all of them. And I did. And, all I had to do was change the name of the villain and some of his attributes, and it worked. And it was, some people say, this reads more like a Shadow novel than a Doc Savage novel. And I think that may be because I wanted to salvage as many Lester Dent Shadow chapters as I could, because they were interestingly written. They were the early Shadow that forced me to do a 1933-34 story, so that we had the early Doc Savage and the early Shadow essentially at odds, but also kind of working together ultimately. And it's a very eerie book in the sense that I wrote it, but I was rewriting Dent, who was imitating Gibson.
Yeah. That's kind of a 15 Degrees of Kevin Bacon situation with
and,
Pulp.
There's one review on Amazon where someone wrote, I think it was another writer, wrote, a mystery writer, said, I read this book, I love it, but it flabbergasted me. He said, he said, it sometimes reads like Lester Dent, and sometimes reads like Walter Gibson, and sometimes reads like both.
Right.
I don't know how this guy did this. Well, partly because I was working with the material I was working with.
Right. So
now, the sequel, Empire of Doom, if you want me to talk about that now, do you have a question?
no, please talk about Empire of
You know,
Doom.
when I get on these podcasts, I just go into a trance and I roll. You know?
Rock and roll, it's what I do. Stream of consciousness.
Okay, so a year or so later, I got the rights to do a sequel, and I had the dimmest of ideas. I wanted, because a lot of people were asking for me to do Doc Savage meets Fu Manchu, and the rights were probably not available. Maybe that's not a good team up. I thought, well, you know, the Shadow's long-term foe, Shiwan Khan, the Golden Master, that's a Street and Smith Fu Manchu. Why don't I use him and have the Shadow and Doc Savage deal with him? And part of my thinking is Walter had written 4 Shiwan Khan installments of the Shadow, and he had said that he left a loophole for Shiwan Khan to return if necessary, and Shiwan Khan never returned.
Right.
But I knew what the loophole was, so I knew I could bring him back plausibly. So what I did is I jumped from 1933 to approximately 1940, and I had from Lester Dent's files a paragraph or two where he described a Doc Savage that he ended up writing very differently. But in his description, he was going to have these criminals take over a destroyer, a U.S. destroyer at a Navy dock, and sail away with it, and suddenly they become a naval power unto themselves. And I said, well, that's a good Shiwan Khan kind of move. Right. You know, he has his people take over the ship. So we set it around 1940, and the ship is hijacked. The Shadow is brought in, Doc Savage is brought in. And the interesting thing about this book that makes it very different than the previous book, which is basically a melodramatic thriller set in the underworld and the gritty 1930s, early Depression era. This is more semi-post-Depression, and Doc Savage has grown to be an international hero. And the Shadow, clandestinely, has started working for the U.S. government on and off, as well as becoming involved in foreign intrigue, where it was, you know, in his interest or the government's interest to do so. So they were operating on a different level. And this was more of a science fiction adventure, globe-spanning story. Because in the Shiwan Khan novels, Walter Gibson, you know, established that Shiwan Khan had a place in Tibet or someplace that was his sanctuary. He called it Kubla Khan. Not Kubla Khan. He called it Shangri-La? No, he called it whatever. Xanadu. What Kubla Khan in the famous poem had a fortress citadel city called Xanadu. Shiwan Khan is said to have had a Xanadu, but Walter never took us there. Right. So I said, we're going to Xanadu. We're going to see what it's like. The battle is going to end up in Xanadu. So I had this really fantastic story in the sense it was science fictional, and it involved global intrigue. It involved Shiwan Khan's attempts to take over the world on a larger scale than Walter had done. And the Shadow and Doc Savage semi-teamed up, came into a closer association, and ended up in Xanadu for their showdown. And I'm not giving away too much of the story because, you know, one, I've forgotten a lot of it,
right?
And two, you know, I don't want to overtell the story.
Of course not. No, people should pick these up. I've got both of them. They're great. You use the same cover artist, right, on those as the new book?
Yep.
Yeah. By the way, we should say right now, I really recommend you guys pick this up. It looks like it's going to have a companion volume. I'll let you talk about that, but it's called Master of Mystery, The Rise of the Shadow. And it's kind of a... Am I correct in assuming this is sort of the setup book? This is sort of the to explain kind of the start of the glory years of the Shadow and exactly how this kind of phenomenon came about. You sort of start at the radio, then you move on to the pulps and talk more about Gibson and so forth and expound upon that. But yeah, what exactly was the beginning of this?
Well, inadvertently, this is a byproduct of updating the Duende history of the Shadow for the 21st century. What had happened is I had that original book OCR'd, and I was expanding it, and I was adding material to it, and I was going to publish it about 3 or 4 years ago. And I foolishly sent it to Condé Nast for more or less their approval, and they assumed that was their official approval, and they disapproved of me publishing the book, which did not make me happy. And we had some, we went to mutual corners, and I put the book aside because there's always a novel I'm writing and always a deadline I have to make, and I rethought the thing. And when I came back to it a year or so ago, the objections had more or less melted away. And I had my designer, co-publisher, Matt Mooring, design the new version of the book, and it was too long. It was too full. And it was like, oh my God, I'm going to charge $50 for this thing. And I'm thinking, what do I do? And through various things, including conversations with my contact at Condé Nast, since they expressed interest in maybe putting it out or being involved in putting it out through a legacy publisher, I have sort of hemmed and hawed on that. And then I thought about, you know what? The solution here is I have 2 books. I have the Duende history, and I have this back matter compendium of interviews, articles, whatever. So I said to everybody, let's divide this book in 2. It's 2 books. So Condé Nast can sort of look at it, the Duende history, and see if they want to be involved in getting it into a bigger arena. And I'll go ahead with the book that I ended up calling Master of Mystery. The original version, the big one, was going to be called Dark Avenger, The Strange Saga of the Shadow.
Yes.
And which is a great title, and I was tempted to use it on this, but I was saving it for the Duende history expansion book. So I called it for a while the Shadow Compendium, and Condé Nast objected because it sounded like an official book. And, that's a good point.
Yeah.
People would think it might be an official book. So I brainstormed some titles, and I came up with this one. I said, I like this better than the Shadow Compendium, so that worked out. So we published this book, and it was, I've been very gratified by the strong response to it, because frankly, it was the back of another book sort of flung together.
Yeah.
And
I noticed this. I'm a huge fan of the Duende history, which, by the way, just a momentary treatise on how utterly stupid I am. For the longest time, I mispronounced the name of that magazine as Duande, because I had never heard anyone say the name out loud. Yeah, this is how touched in the head I am. But I may have even recorded it on a podcast. Yeah. But I got it years ago, and I've been in love with it for years. Came out in like late 70s, right? Something like that?
January 1980, if I don't remember correctly.
Okay. Early 80s. Now, Duende, I actually do want to get into this. Even that was kind of a compilation of earlier stuff you had done. It was sort of like a fanzine, sort of.
Yeah, I called it a journal, but it was a glorified fanzine.
Yeah.
We tried using better paper and better production values, and in my youthful pompousness, I would, when people said I love your fanzine, well, it's actually a journal. I call it a journal, but it's a fanzine, but it's a journal too.
Really like the stuff in the Duende history of the Shadow, where Walter Gibson talks about his process in conceiving the character and how he's portrayed, because I still say one of the most fascinating and engaging things about the Shadow as a character that puts him in a class above even the many imitators, some of whom are more commercially successful than he is, and we don't need to say any names. Batman! I think it has a lot to do with the fact that Walter Gibson had this sense of what was the quote? It was something like, you have to treat your character as if he is real, but he is beyond you.
Yeah.
Like you can learn a lot, but you can't know everything.
Yeah.
Which I love, and all that stuff is great in there. So when did you first start with the Duende stuff, and what inspired you to do that? Because it was more of a pulp, a kind of a catch-all for pulp stuff in general, right?
Yeah. I was in college, as I recall, and I came up with, I don't really remember the ABCs of it, so I'm going to sort of grope here a little bit.
Right.
But I came in contact with some people who were starting a pulp reprint house, Odyssey Publications, which I later became, affiliated with, co-owner. And I'd come up with this idea, and I don't know what order things happened to, but they offered to publish it or co-publish it. And, I was in college. I didn't have much money. So, I jumped at the chance. And we put out the first issue and then the second issue. And the third issue morphed into this all shadow issue that morphed into this book.
Yeah.
The Duende History of the Shadow. I mean, it has a ridiculous title because it was really something else. That's not really a good commercial title. Yet it sold well. We sold out our first printing. Sold out our second printing eventually, and then we didn't go back. But, it was very successful for its time, given its limitations, and my limitations. But it was very good. And people have been asking me for years to reprint it or expand it. And they've been also starting to ask me to collect my Shadow articles and interludes from the Sanctum books reprints. And I tend to like to focus on new things, but between the drum beats and the fact that someone I knew, a guy named Tim King, who was a shadow collector, commissioned from Joe DeVito a shadow cover to hang on his wall, and suddenly we had a full color shadow cover that was professional looking. I said, once we have a cover, an existing cover, getting a book together is actually much more financially and practically doable. So I think that cover may have been one of the reasons why I did this, because it meant from a standpoint of assembling something, I had one of the key portions.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have many agents of the Shadowcast, and some of I've directed them to ask their questions on social media for you. Are you opposed to taking some of these queries from the audience? We got quite a few. Let's see here. They have a lot of questions for you as far as the pulps go. Mike Deginger asked, do you prefer the Shadow to be a more grounded magician, like in the pulps, or more mystical, as seen and heard in the radio dramas and some of the filmic adaptations?
Well, I see them as two different versions of the character, and I like them both for different reasons.
Right.
I find the novels more compelling because as a writer, the written word is more interesting to me.
Yeah.
But I have to say the Orson Welles Shadows, where he had really unusual powers, are just as compelling. They're just very different.
Yes.
So, when I first encountered a shadow novel, it was in the 1960s, one of the Dennis Lynn's Belmont Shadows, The Shadow's Revenge. I read that thing 3 times over several years because I couldn't find any more shadow novels. I was a teenager. And that combined both, and I really liked that. But the fact is, I am more, I cleave more to the Walter Gibson version, even though that wasn't the first version I encountered.
Right. And that's... Was it the radio or the books that came first for you? You talk about it a little bit in the book, but I'm sort of teeing this up for you.
It's very interesting with the Shadow. He's so dominated certain, media during different times, comics, pulps, and radio. When they began the revival of old-time radio in '63, I think it was, They started airing The Shadow, and I think one other program. It might have been
Green Hornet, maybe?
no, I didn't hear that for a few years. It was either Black Museum or the Many Lives of Harry Lime, something like that.
Oh, that's a good one.
But the first radio program that was revived in '63 that started the cycle of reruns of old-time radio for baby boomers and for older people who were nostalgic for that stuff. The Shadow was the tip of the spear. It was the Shadow they put out first, and that's what I heard first. And I was very captivated by that. And the crummy Archie comic came out within a year of that. I bought it even though it was obviously inferior. And then I found The Shadow's Revenge. And then a few years later, I found my first Bantam Books Walter Gibson reprint, The Living Shadow. And when I read The Living Shadow, even though I loved the Belmont book and loved the radio program, the difference was night and day.
Yeah.
I mean, it was hard to read the Belmont books when I found them after I found Shadow novels that were from the 1930s.
I know. It blows my mind how, so you guys published, and actually this leads to another question that somebody asked of you, and you mentioned earlier, you and Anthony Tollin would talk a little bit about the reprints and whatnot. CSD asks, how long did you guys spend on the stories, and was anything ever cut that you felt was solid enough to be made into a book? I suppose he's talking about your interludes and so forth. But, we're talking about how, you guys had done this, but you also kind of published them out of order. You decided to publish them instead of doing from The Living Shadow on, which maddens a lot of people trying to get these, by the way. But but it was what exactly went into that? You talked about how certain issues were themed, but how did the idea of them not being in order, how did that you land on that?
Here was the basic problems. Everybody who'd reprinted The Shadow conked out after a certain number of volumes. Joe went the longest. I think they did 23, 24. The Bantams, they only did 7, 8, and the Belmonts went 8 or 9, and they weren't reprints.
Yeah.
So we knew The Shadow had a terrible track record as a reprint, and we were also reprinting Doc Savage, which had been reprinted to death. You could go on eBay and get any Doc Savage novel you want that's been reprinted for probably $1 a pop.
So you were trying to get the best ones out there first, in other words.
Partly the best ones, but partly to to put aside the ones that have been most reprinted. Some of the Bantams went through multiple editions. Some of the later Bantams only had one edition, so they're comparatively more scarce. With The Shadow, we also felt the earliest Shadows weren't the strongest. It was Tony's idea to reprint The Golden Vulture, which is Lester Dent's only Shadow novel, because his thinking was Doc Savage readers would probably be interested in that, which was good thinking.
Yeah.
The other thing was the Crime Insured, which is one of the major Shadow novels.
A great novel.
Yeah. And for Doc Savage, we did The Fortress of Solitude and its sequel, The Devil Genghis, because it was a recurring villain. Fortress of Solitude was a very famous Doc Savage novel. And, in the context of the Bantam editions, neither one of them went through a lot of editions, and they'd never been reprinted together. So we were strategizing so that we would not be turning off anybody who previously bought Shadow paperbacks, or anybody who had already had Shadow Doc Savage paperbacks. They would want these for the original covers, the original interior illustrations, etc. It was Tony's idea to include the interior illustrations, which I thought were kind of old-fashioned and might spoil it.
I love those.
Yeah, I love them too.
Yeah.
But Tony was right. They added to the package. Everything we could do to add to the package. Yeah. Doc Savage fans bought the Docs because we added to the package. Shadow fans bought the Shadow because they couldn't read these stories otherwise. They weren't previously reprinted. So we did the right thing because we had to overcome with both series two huge obstacles. One was The Shadow just wasn't resonating for paperback publishers. And Doc Savage had been reprinted to death. They were opposite.
Yeah, I was going to add, that was going to be my follow-up question. Why do you think, so it was night and day in terms of how Doc Savage did and the Shadow did. We haven't even talked about this on the podcast yet, so this is as good as a segue as any, I suppose. But the Shadow and Doc Savage both started to be reprinted in pretty much the same format in pretty much around the same time. And the Shadow petered out after a few dozen issues, and Doc Savage continued well into the 80s, 90s, and obviously we just talked about Doc Savage novels that you did. They're still happening today. So what do you think was the difference here? Why didn't the Shadow resonate? And what was going on there? Because I read Walter Gibson's biography recently, which is a mixed affair. I had mixed feelings about how it was written, but it's a good biography in the overall. And one of the constant recurrent themes was he would go through these periods where he didn't even want to talk about the Shadow because he was so frustrated by the fact that Condé Nast would not put them back in print. And because they had a movie option out or something, you know what I mean? So what do you think was at play? Was it just politics? Was it what?
No, it wasn't politics. I remember seeing a letter in the Condé Nast files back in the 70s where someone at Bantam Books wrote to Condé Nast and said, well, we've once again gone through a file of your Shadow stories, and once again we've decided we don't think they would be right for today's market. And a year or so later, they start coming out with their reprints, and the reason why is the Doc Savage kept selling and selling. And they could not do the Shadow. The Shadow was actually more popular in the sense of being published twice a month. So they took a shot at it. And I think the mistake they made was doing them more or less sequentially. The first three stories, they're pretty old-fashioned even for the 1930s, and they're a little slow-moving.
Especially the third one. I don't know.
Yeah.
The first two, I think, hold up rather well. But yeah, the Shadow laughs a little on the sluggish side.
Yeah. So if they had jumped ahead and just done some quintessential more fast action or science fiction or wildly melodramatic Shadows, and they'd had better covers. I think Jim Bama, who did the Doc Savage covers, told me he would have killed these Shadow covers, but they gave it to someone else.
Right.
And I think Jim Bama's covers would have sold that.
Right. Well, great artist. Of course, it's hard to imagine the Shadow with a ripped shirt. I don't know.
Well, the folk is not out of bounds.
Right.
He would have done that, and he would have made them sell as best they could.
Right.
Now you'll notice when Jove did a bunch a few years later, they did 23, 24, and those Steranko covers, helped them sell. They sold well.
Magnificent.
Yeah.
Cool little tidbit to promote your book, by the way. The cool little tidbit. It's actually from the Duende history, I think, as well. The interview with Walter Gibson. Steranko's waiting in the wings, so he jumps in a couple of times and corrects some details. So it's actually a three-way. It's a handicap match. It's Walter Gibson. You're interviewing Walter Gibson, and Steranko is kind of in the background somewhere, occasionally weighing in, which is really cool. He's a big name in Shadow fandom.
He certainly is. I think the other problem is Walter Gibson's writing style was old-fashioned to a degree even for his time. Lester Dent was very much a fan of Dashiell Hammett, and he kept up on modern writing of that era. And he was always trying to better himself as a writer. Walter was a little older. He had different influences, wider influences perhaps too, and he had a different problem with the Shadow. He had to write 2 novels a month, which means he couldn't fall into ruts or do formulas or necessarily take one tone or one approach to the stories. Whereas Lester Dent, once he developed what he called the Kenneth Robeson style of writing, he could just crank them out.
Right.
Because to him it was kind of it was fun, and he could repeat himself.
Right.
Twice a month on the Shadow could not repeat himself.
Which caused him to create, I forget where I read this, it could have been one of the reprints, could have been the biography where Gibson kind of described how he would have, like, he couldn't have one formula. He had like 5 or 6 that he would rotate out.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that Walter even had necessarily a formula early on. He used to say he had to approach each story as if it was a whole new thing.
Yeah.
Because again, you can't repeat when you go in twice a month. You'll kill your audience. You always had to top what you did before, or deviate from it, or do a slight variation on something. So I don't think he fell into a formula into the 40s or maybe the later 30s.
Right. That actually brings me to an actual audience question, which was Megatron 94 asks, do you think there is a limit, because you have a wider expertise just in pulp. In a lot of ways, I guess you are a new pulp writer. We both are. I had one published recently, incidentally. But do you think there's a limit for how many stories, how many kinds of stories can be written within sort of the strictures of pulp?
You mean in terms of the Shadow, or just generally?
I assume he's talking here about hero pulps.
Well, they certainly tried some esoteric things with the Green Llama and White Indian and a couple others that were a little bit off trail. Yeah. I think in terms of pulp, you could do almost anything as long as it has the action quality of pulp. It's hard to do a pulp romance that's a true romance, because true pulp romances weren't that pulpy. They were more corny than they were pulpy, but I guess they were pulpy in a way too.
Yeah.
But I don't know that there were limitations. I remember talking to Steranko a few conventions ago about the future of film, in the sense that the Western genre is all but dead. They hardly make them anymore, where they used to be ubiquitous.
Yeah, Alec Baldwin hasn't helped that recently,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
no.
Unfortunately.
And the private eye is kind of dead too, because a modern private detective tends to be an IT guy. He tends to use computers as much as anything else. And you're going to watch a movie about a guy at a screen half the time. They do make those movies now. People are at screens at movies all the time. It can be made dramatic, but it's not as compelling as the guy knocking on a tenement door, hoping he doesn't get shot, just trying to get a lead on this missing woman,
Right.
So I was saying to Steranko and to others that, there are going to have to be new genres. And there aren't too many things that are new. But one thing that I remember saying, and this is maybe 6 or 7 years ago, which I think is becoming more true, I said, science fiction will always be relevant.
Yeah.
It's getting more relevant. Superhero movies may or may not last a long time, but they're probably not going to go away. And so you have that. Mystery, suspense, thrillers. But one of the genres that has been around for a while, but it's now starting to surface as a more common genre, is what I basically call the astronaut movie, the men in space movie.
Yeah.
Not a science fiction movie, so to speak, but working men in space.
The Martian, whatever. That one,
Golden
Golden Globe Best Picture a few years ago.
There's something that Netflix has, I think it's a Japanese thing, called The Silent Sea. It's basically people going to the moon to accomplish a technical mission and what they encounter. And, Gravity was another. And I said it a few years ago, and since then there's been a fair number of films and TV shows like that. Working in space is a relatively new vocation that more and more people are getting into, and it doesn't have to be science fiction. It can be a little forward-looking, but it's contemporary.
Which is cool. Do you move much? You mentioned you are familiar with Barry Reese, who's also a newer pulp writer. I've just jumped into the field. How do you feel about the new crop of sort of there's a bit of a pulp revolution going on with, maybe it's the shortened attention spans of people. They want the shorter plot-driven, action-driven fiction, whatever it is, but something's in the air right now. Are you locked into that very much? I suppose you're moving in that space.
Well, I was, this has come up in conversations, and I don't know how to put myself in the context of new pulp. Yeah. Since I started writing Doc Savage around I wrote my first Doc Savage in 1979, 80. Right. It wasn't published till 91. Before me, David Lind did those Shadow novels in the 60s, and after that, Ron Goulart did New Avenger novels. So if you think about the legacy of new pulp writers, it pretty much starts with Dennis Lind's, may include the guys who wrote a few James Bond novels after Ian Fleming died. Definitely includes Ron Goulart's Avengers, then my Doc Savages. And then this other group, this younger group of people came in with new pulp. I was not part of that. I did not write for those publishers. I haven't written for those publishers. I've been involved with them. They've given me awards. I'm very gratified. I've won, I'm staring at them now. I don't have my glasses, but I've won 2 cool awards. One is a plaque, and the other is more of a little sculpture of a pen, a quill pen. And for some of my more recent Wild Adventures books, but I'm not really part of that flow because I was there before, and that flow, that organization, that group, kind of came up over in the other pasture, while I was doing other things. So I don't feel like I'm a part of it, yet I also feel like, well, if there's such a thing as new pulp in the larger sense, it goes back to the 1960s and Dennis Lind's, continues through Ron Goulart and me, and then goes through them and comes back to me. But I sort of see them as a different tribe over on the other side of the hill, sort of tilling the same field I am. But I should back up a minute. I've written for Moonstone Books, right, which is part of that. So yeah, I have toiled in that field. I've written the Green Hornet and the Avenger stuff, and the Spider for them. So I am sort of in that field too. But again, I was tilling my earth before them. Right. And I sort of feel
kind of a Plymouth Rock landed on me situation. Yeah. A little bit.
Yeah, so I remember someone reached out and said, "Would you put the new pulp logo on your new Doc Savage novels?" And I talked to my co-publisher about it, and we just felt like, well, these are authorized books from Condé Nast. They're probably going to say or ask. They're going to minimally ask what's new pulp and who. In other words, there were issues that may cause us to have to take it off if we put it on. So we decided we would not do that. Okay. And it's awkward because I have a lot of affinity for these guys.
Yeah, there's some great writers in the field.
I would hate to be the only guy doing this stuff, right. Like some freak who's just trying to keep the torch alive after everybody else has moved on. So I'm supportive of them in spirit. But I don't read their books. I don't read anybody's books. I got to tell you, between the columns I write, the stories I write, short stories I write, the novels I write, I have no leisure time for reading. Except if I'm writing a Spider novel, I'm reading or rereading old Spider novels. If I'm writing Doc Savage, I'm rereading old Doc Savages to get into that mindset.
That brings a question to mind. The Shadow has no shortage of imitators. No. He spawned arguably a genre. I mean, actually, it's probably not arguable. There is a genre that sprang up around the Shadow. And do you have a particular favorite of the imitators that came later? We're talking people like Secret Agent X, the Spider.
Yeah. I have to say the Spider. I'm writing my 3rd Spider now. Ooh. I've written, I'm on my 3rd Spider novel. I've written 3 Spider short stories, novelettes before that. And I find the character very compelling, very refreshing to write because he has real emotional dimension. The stories are just as over the top as everybody else's is, and maybe more so. Yeah. But the characters are very well realized. and you can give them more human emotion and reaction. They're not just steely-eyed stalwarts like some of the others who just, charge into a room with guns blazing, and they're dodging bullets and they're knocking down their enemies. Yeah. And the Spider goes in cursing and laughing and getting shot pretty regularly and just saying, well, I'm bleeding to death, but I'm going to keep fighting. I mean, that's a different level of pulp.
Yeah, it's almost like the Tinsley Shadow a little bit, where it's more action, a little more vulnerable, but more like steely and determined a little bit, kind of similar in that sense.
Tinsley and Norval Page, the Spider writer, were close friends, and they helped each other plot their respective novels from time to time.
Yeah, Tinsley was a fine writer, one of the better guys to do the Shadow. He's, for those who are not aware, he's sort of the number 2 after Walter Gibson in terms of the guys that wrote Shadow novels. Obviously, Gibson wrote darn near every word of the Shadow pulps, but quite a few were done by Tinsley as well. Speaking of stories that I know a lot of my fans talk about quite a bit, you did some Executioner stuff, and like Mac Bolan and the Destroyer and stuff like that. Like, whoa, how did you fall into that? What took place there? Because I know a lot of people who are big fans of those series.
Well, I had an opportunity to interview Warren Murphy and Richard Saper on the Destroyer. I discovered them around 1980, and I really I discovered them a little late, about 10 years after they started, and I really loved them. And I forget how it came about. It was for a magazine. I interviewed them, and they loved the interview, and they decided, since the magazine was dragging its feet on publishing the interview, they got this idea of doing a nonfiction book called The Assassin's Handbook, and they wanted me to sort of co-write it with them and assemble it from old material they had from the books, but include the interview. And that led to me doing my first Destroyer. And then I did another one a year or so later. Then they canceled the series, and they gave me the last Destroyer to write. Then they uncanceled the series like 6 weeks later and said, can you write 4 a year? And so I did 4 Destroyers a year for approximately 10 years. So I did 40 Destroyer novels.
Nice. Very nice.
And when the Destroyer went to Gold Eagle, who published The Executioner, I had the opportunity to write 1 Executioner. I only wrote 1.
Yeah.
It was interesting to write 1. It wasn't interesting to write too many more. So I just did the 1 that I did.
Yeah, it's kind of like reading Punisher comics. A little bit goes a long way.
The Executioner is a very interesting character in his single-mindedness, but he's a little like writing Tarzan, which I like to write, and Nick Fury, which I also wrote. I wrote a Nick Fury novel. All of those characters are more two-dimensional than three-dimensional. And if you try to make them three-dimensional, they lose the essence of who they are. You can't improve upon them. They are what they are, and they are exactly what they're supposed to be.
Right.
But if you try to raise them a level, you run the risk of distorting who they are by giving them an extra human dimension.
Well put. The good fan question to transition into that. Eric Lamontagne asks, good day to you both, Razor and Will. What do you think it is that causes people to believe the Shadow needs to be, quote, modernized for today's audience? I ask because I got into an argument with someone who said modern heroes are more appealing than those, quote, boring characters who just kill generic criminals, unquote, which I found comical because I just finished reading The Hydra, and there was nothing boring or generic about that story. Right. So I guess he's kind of asking about this phenomenon.
Well, I thought Dennis Lins did a respectable job when he modernized the Shadow in the 1960s. Yeah. But as I said before, once I read my first Shadow novel, even though it wasn't the best, The Living Shadow, the writing was so different. The I don't know, the texture of the character. I don't know how to describe it because it's been a long time, obviously. But even a weak Shadow novel has a certain weight to it. Right. And a modern book, even a 50-year-old modern book like the Dennis Lin novel, it's lighter somehow.
Right.
Maybe like conviction, maybe he treats the character as just a puppet, whereas Gibson was exploring the character and expanding the character. To go to the heart of the question, I'm not against, and I don't think it's a bad idea to modernize any of these characters if it's done intelligently and is well received.
Yeah.
But I personally prefer Doc Savage and the Shadow in their own time.
Right.
But, they could have slipped into the 50s without too much change. They
Yeah.
might have slipped into the early 60s without having to be bent out of shape. But by the late 60s, I don't know that the Shadow could have operated in the world of hippies and Vietnam and LSD and wild hair and clothing.
Right.
And, I'm just not sure how
It would have been rough seeing Lamont Cranston with like a popped collar and bell bottoms, is all I'm saying.
Yeah. Or even just mingling with, the type of people
Right.
that existed at that time, who, I was one of them, but it's like the world had changed so radically from the very rigid world of that time. I mean, that was a time where if you were an adult male, you wore a suit hat and coat, most of the time. It was a uniform, and women wore hats and sometimes gloves, even in the summer, and sometimes veils, even when they weren't in mourning. The rigidness. And, I remember reading old newspaper articles when I was doing research for my various projects. And, there was a man about town kind of question, not a man about town, but, a reporter who would go up to people in the street and ask questions and said, okay, it's Labor Day. Do you put away your straw hat and you start wearing your fall hat? Or do you keep your straw hat going until the weather changes? And people are giving very sincere and well-reasoned answers to that question, because in those days, every male had a straw hat they wore in the summer, and when the cooler weather came, they switched to a non-straw hat, but they always wore a friggin' hat.
Right.
And it's like, that is not the world we live in today.
No, not at all. And more's the pity in some cases. Some of the outfits I see people wear at Walmart, I wish suits were in greater abundance to me.
There's that too. But the point is that it was a rigid, predictable environment where if you went to a restaurant, you had to check your hat with the hat check lady and redeem it for money. So that hat was costing you money every time you went to eat. We don't have that problem anymore. You can't check your hat or your coat except in the finest restaurants or clubs that may still have that old tradition, but that's not a tradition people have anymore. People aren't just formal in dress or in demeanor. And the Shadow belonged to a world that was very indelible. Things were predictable. And if someone wore a beard or had long hair in 1933 or 43, there was something really off about them, whereas that's not true now.
Right. So we're in a unique period now for the Shadow in that you've seen enough come and go. You can recognize the pattern. I certainly can. Condé Nast seemed to go through periods since they've taken over the Shadow, following the dissolution of Street and Smith, where they kind of seem to go through fits and starts, where they kind of withdraw the licenses. I assume that had something to do with the Sanctum reprints ending prematurely, and they kind of as they gear up to go through a new push with the character, whether it's in TV or movies or comics or whatever, right? They pull the licenses and then they make another push. So we're in a new push now, or at least at the very beginning stages of what appears to be one, it seems like. And we just got a new novel. Fan Nikki Ferreira says, if you have read it, can you give a one-sentence review of the new Shadow novel, the James Patterson, in air quotes, novel?
I have not read it. I have read a lot of reviews, and they don't lead me to want to read the book.
Yeah, they're not.
I'm sorry.
Don't inspire a ton of confidence.
I was looking forward to seeing what was done. I agree with Condé Nast making an attempt to modernize the character. This does not seem. Let me just say this. This is what shocked me about that. I had assumed before this book came out that there weren't a lot of people invested in the original Shadow or the radio or Pulp character.
Right.
And that, they would get some negative reviews from people who were offended by whatever they did, no matter what they did. It didn't matter. There were people who were going to say this isn't the Shadow or this isn't the right way to do the Shadow. What shocked me and what I did not expect is the numbers of people who didn't read the pulp magazines, may have seen a movie or two, read some comics, aren't invested in the character, but took a shot at buying the book to see what was done and basically dismissed it as this isn't the Shadow. More people were invested in a concept of the Shadow that pre-exists, even if the concept wasn't the same concept. The radio concept and the pulp concept, even the comics concept, they tend to be at variance with one another.
I find that fascinating. I noticed that as well.
I did not expect that.
Yeah,
you know what? Go ahead.
And let me know if you think I'm off base here, but it seems like, and this has been a recurrent element on the podcast, is we're kind of analyzing the character and his enduring appeal. He seems to, this is a 90-year-old character. He turns 90 this year. And yet he seems to come around like a bad rash every few years. It doesn't go away. He's got that Batman appeal, even if he doesn't have the breakthrough success the way that he did in the 30s and 40s. The Shadow was a major paradigm-shattering success in the 30s and 40s. But I think there's something elemental. Maybe it's the name, the look. There's something archetypal. Maybe it's because he spawned this genre or whatever. There's just
I think there is something archetypal, but I think the other thing is that 90 years of intermittent product, especially in recent years, has saturated the public consciousness with a concept of the Shadow that may not be entirely valid, but is fixed in their mind. It's like Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes works best in his time, and that time is so removed from our time, you would think Sherlock Holmes stories would be passé. They are not. They are still read, and imitation stories are still being written, and movies are being filmed, and TV shows are being filmed. The character's eternal. The Shadow is like that. Unfortunately, he was allowed to sort of disappear in the 1950s. He came back in the 60s thanks to the radio revival. Various comic books and reprints have brought him around enough to remind people of who he was, what he was, and I think the Shadow that was established is basically like Sherlock Holmes. He's eternal. No matter what you do to him, no matter how you update him, the public will generally point to some version of the Shadow that went before as, that's the Shadow. You can't tell me this new version is the Shadow. He doesn't wear the cloak. He doesn't have the hat. He doesn't have the Sherlock Holmes profile. He doesn't have the guns, whatever. Right. It really shocked me because I thought that an updated Shadow, the time had come, and the people who would turn their back on it or criticize it were comparatively small, and I was wrong. The Shadow is the Shadow is the Shadow. Okay, and it's I don't know what they're going to do with the series except plow on, but it appears to be no matter how successful it is books and whether it leads to a TV show or a movie, no one can say at this point, but it appears to have been a step away, an unfortunate step away from the core character. And I think the biggest mistake that was made that I'm aware of with the new book, and I don't like criticizing other people's books because, as I said, I think this was something they should have tried, and they did try. But the writer went out of his way to say those pulp magazines, they weren't real. That was just fiction, and the radio programs, they weren't real. And you basically say to anybody who bought this book, who has some kind of interest in the Shadow, the Shadow of their understanding, the shadow of their perception, the character they think is the shadow, whether that's the real shadow or not, they're offended by that. Basically, they're willing to go along for the ride of a new shadow if you don't poison the well on the original shadow. And I've never heard of a character being revived in such a way that the earliest incarnations, the foundations, are essentially demolished and said, none of that stuff happened. Forget it.
And mocked a little bit too. If you read the book, that's the weird part.
You know, when DC revived the Flash and the Green Lantern in the late 50s, they didn't say those characters didn't exist. They brought those guys back once these guys took hold. When they brought back the Human Torch and Captain America, they didn't say, oh, those old corny stories didn't happen. They didn't address it necessarily, but they implied that these are the same characters. Not the Human Torch. They reinvented him, but they brought back the original Human Torch too. So, you know, they had their kick. And, you know, and this is, it's very important not to trash your foundation.
Yeah, it's you just referred to this. There have been multiple periods of the Shadow from his golden age. There in the 30s and 40s. We've had the brief revival in the 90s. That's when I came in. You know, my generation would have been introduced with the Alec Baldwin film, which, despite being a disappointment at the time, survived and aged very well on video and on re-airings and so forth, and as a result had the effect of introducing a whole generation to the character, so had kind of a positive effect regardless. But what would you say, the Shadow Loaf Knows asks, as a historian of the Shadow, you're obviously well-versed in its various eras and periods. The earliest beginnings, the height of popularity, its relative obscurity in the modern day, etc. But which, in your opinion, would be the worst? Well, actually, in your opinion, or objectively, what would be the worst?
The worst incarnation of the Shadow?
The worst period, yeah.
Period.
Yeah.
The worst period. I would have to say the 60s. But even there, I have to split hairs. The radio show had been revived in reruns, so that was good. The Archie comic, even though I have a lot of nostalgia about it, I still have my copies. That was pretty poor. They made a superhero out of him. And the Belmont Shadows, even though I loved the one I first read, and I read most of them, I don't think I've read them all to this day, I give them a lot of credit for modernizing the character and finding a way to bring him into the 60s plausibly. They're pretty pale compared to Walter Gibson's stories.
Yeah, they're pretty alive. And fortunately, on the back end of it, I mean, it does seem like... didn't the Belmonts kind of turn him secret agent-ish?
Yeah, and that was a reasonable elaboration of the character, because sometimes the Shadow did, in the 1930s and 40s, do government missions or go to foreign countries.
And towards the end, correct me if I'm wrong, but the radio show towards the end, in like the early 50s, he was doing work with the government and he had a handler.
It's true. It's true. So it wasn't that much of a reach. They did give him some of the radio powers, but that wasn't that big a reach. Right. That's not for, if you want to say this is a new incarnation of the same old Shadow or a continuation, you could say, well, you know, I'll buy it. You know, I mean, I can't say this is Walter Gibson's Shadow, because he has specific powers he didn't have in Gibson's stories. But the abilities weren't that far from Gibson's version's abilities.
Right.
So, again, I want to give credit to them, to that being a plausible reimagining of the character for its time. They got onto the James Bond Man from U.N.C.L.E. trend and they said, we'll make the Shadow fit into that. It was a good fit for that time.
Yeah. Okay, so we've been talking for like an hour here, and I should probably start winding this up. But as we do wrap this up, I'm actually interested in this question. I find it intriguing myself. First off, before we say anything else, the book is Master of Mystery, The Rise of the Shadow. I have devoured it now twice, and it's fantastic. It's got a lot of stuff I was aware of and a lot of stuff that I wasn't, and it's fantastically formatted, by the way. I have to say, I love the illustrations, both on the cover and the interior illustrations. Great stuff. I love that Frank Hamilton stuff always. But regardless, go out, pick this up. So the question is from Nick Montelongo. And he asks, and I'll answer first, and then I'll throw it to you, because I think everyone's got a different answer for this who's read the pulps. If you were to adapt any of Gibson's books, the Gibson Shadow books, for a film adaptation of The Shadow, which has been kicked around a lot recently, because now they're apparently doing an Amazon series, whatever, of Doc Savage, so maybe The Shadow will be in the wings. So if you could adapt any of Gibson's books for a film or a TV adaptation, which one would you personally choose that you think would translate well?
I'm not sure I could point to a single novel off the top of my head.
Oh.
And even if I could come up with 3 or 4, it would be hard to choose one of those. But I would say, if I were to do a movie, I would look to the 3 Voodoo Master stories.
Ooh.
Because between the 3 of them, you have enough material to synthesize a story that would be creepy, appropriately creepy for the Shadow, have an interesting villain, still have a story that was grounded in the kind of Gibsonian reality, yet also, verging on the mystical. So I would say the 3 Voodoo Master stories, without singling one of them, could be a film and a sequel.
Yeah, those were so well written. I did a little audio book excerpt thing. By the way, they recorded fantastic audiobooks of the Shadow Pulp reprints. I wish they had done more of them. There's only 5 or 6. They got a full voice cast and sound effects and music. It's absolutely superb. For my part, I've said this ever since I read it. I think you need the introduction and you need the Mysterioso character you can't quite define in the background, kind of element to it. So I would combine 2, actually. I would take kind of the introductory aspect of the Living Shadow, and then I would pair that with the main sort of drive of the story would be something like a crime gang network story, like a Gangdom's Doom or a Red Menace or something like that. Attach those 2 things together so that you introduce Harry Vincent, and through Harry Vincent's eyes, you kind of are introduced to this phenomenon of the Shadow. And then you kind of follow through as he kind of, more of a crime movie is really what I'm describing. But, kind of combining 2 things like that, I think would work pretty well. But it'll be interesting to see what Condé Nast does, because it seems like they're gearing up for something else. Hopefully this, the reception of the James Patterson novel does not render this a non-starter. But yeah, I can't thank you enough for sharing your time with us here on the Shadowcast. Is there anything else that you wanted to shout out to the Shadow fans or make anyone aware of as far as what you'll be working on next?
Well, I do plan to do another book on the Shadow, probably the expanded Duende History of the Shadow, which is now called Dark Avenger. I'm not sure when it's going to come out because we have other books that are closer to being done. I'd like to mention my website, www.adventuresinbronze.com. Adventures in Bronze is all one word, lowercase, where you can see all my books. And all these books are available on softcover and ebook on Amazon. My hardcover editions can only be obtained through my website, adventuresinbronze.com. So anybody who's interested in my other books like The Shadow, Tarzan, Doc Savage, King Kong, all these characters I've revived in the last decade, go to adventuresinbronze.com and you'll see everything I've done. But, I'm really excited by the response to Master of Mystery. I'm looking forward to getting Dark Avenger out when I can. And if the interest is still strong, there will probably be a third collection of Shadow articles.
Very, very cool. Well, we will be awaiting it with bated breath. Thank you for treating with the agents of the Shadowcast here today. Having now concluded that long overdue and much appreciated interview, we will now move on to the subject of this episode. This is, of course, Season 2, The Pulp Avenger. Last episode, we covered the Death Tower, and today we delve into the Silent Seven. It's sort of unspoken continuation, and this was a curious experiment in continuity. This was the first time since the initial trilogy of Shadow novels, so The Living Shadow, Eyes of the Shadow, and The Shadow Laughs, that we were getting a more or less proper continuation. Of course, in the first novel, we have the acknowledgement of the Silent Seven and the Faithful 50. And strangely enough, it's precisely that plot thread that's supposed to weave the two stories together that is not followed up here. Obviously, the Silent Seven and the Faithful 50 are absolutely referred to and ultimately dealt with by the Shadow. But the specific characters that reveal the existence of this organization and divulge their allegiance at the end of the last novel, absolutely do not show up and presumably are not brought to justice here. What a great cold open, man. It must be said, with Walter B. Gibson Shadow novels, he had a way of setting a scene. If you listen to the audiobook I did recently of the Shadow Pulp Double Z, you know exactly how great Walter Gibson is at setting the stage. And frankly, the pacing of the beginning of that story was a little more leisurely. The action doesn't really enter in until the end of the second chapter, which is a long time for a pulp. That's actually demanding quite a bit of the reader's patience by the standards of that day. You know, the kind of Kenneth Robeson logic, the Theodore Tinsley logic was start on action, end on action. You know, you really want to get right into it. But here, Walter Gibson, I love, he realizes, I think with retrospect, Will Murray mentioned, you know, he's a little more of an old-fashioned writer. And I actually am not sure I agree with that. I think he is a little more mature in some ways than some of the other pulp writers. I think he realized that there are other ways, there are other kinds of action. There's not just bullets flying. There's mental action, there's atmospheric action. There are, in short, other ways to draw in a reader than just blood, guts, and gore and explosions, right? He understood this. And this is a perfect example of how. Now, I already read the opening little kind of setting the stage segment, so I won't belabor the point here. I actually read it via comparison when I was reviewing the James Patterson Shadow novel, because one of the biggest flaws with that book was just the prosaic quality was absolute dreck. It was like it was written by a 15-year-old. It's just there was nothing to it. There was no atmosphere to it, no artistry to it. And then I compared that to the opening of The Silent Seven. And the reason I chose The Silent Seven was literally just because the book was sitting right there. You know, I didn't have any particular affinity for the opening of this story. But in retrospect, it sets the stage amazingly. We just open on a stooped old man walking with a strange gait. And he's sort of looking up at a house ominously. And then he kind of looks down, sort of clears his throat, and he sort of hobbles his way up the steps. We get a sense of, you know, he's got some kind of thrombosis or an arthritic condition or something. As he pushes the doorbell, it makes him uncomfortable. And then he's ushered into the home, and you're introduced to a bunch of characters who seem familiar, but they also might appear to have dubious motives. And all of these things are just, it's mystery upon mystery. We're just being introduced to the characters and we're just starting to get their context when it's established that a murder has occurred, and a murder in classic Walter B. Gibsonian fashion that is a strange, like, riddle wrapped in an enigma whereby a man collapses at his desk dead, and suddenly you would think, okay, maybe a heart attack, maybe even, if we're just assuming classic crime logic, maybe he was poisoned. You know, there's a million different things that it could be in one of these kind of stories. No. We got to engineer an extremely elaborate demise for this man, whereby a needle concealed in his desk, like an anti-theft device, he had rigged up in his desk because this man apparently cherished his secrets, malfunctioned and wound up poisoning him when he failed to put the thimble on his finger or something to that effect. Really fascinating. And then you find the message in the desk that is encoded. This coded stuff, this is so cool. So Walter Gibson, obviously, you were already beginning to see at this early juncture in the Shadow stories that he was fascinated with, like, ciphers and codes, and I imagine the man probably had books upon books upon books. One of the things I was reading in Walter Gibson's biography was that he had a huge library, just a massive library. In fact, I believe there were multiple libraries in his home, just multiple rooms for him, and he would try to have, you know, somewhere to lie down. You know, he kind of rigged it up basically so he could write in any room anytime he wanted, which is genius. It's one of the most pulp things I've ever heard in my life. Anytime the inspiration seized him in any room of his house, he could just sit down and start writing. Love that. So I have no doubt that he probably had code-breaking books upon code-breaking books. And so you think Walter Gibson's going to do the classic thing. I think even he was conscious that he was starting to have tropes with regard to, like, codes and secret handshakes and so forth. And already he's subverting it. We're only on the Silent Seven, guys. And he's already subverting it. We're not even through the first year of stories. I love this. There's this segment, really, when we start kind of moving the plot forward, uncovering exactly what's going on. We just open on a murder mystery, and then we ultimately move into a far greater criminal conspiracy. So I guess we should talk the overall theme of the story before we move on. So we've already had sort of the other archetypes of Shadow stories, where he's already come up against something approximating a supervillain. He's already come up against, of course, gangsters. I mean, it doesn't get much more in that mold than Gangdom's Doom. And, you know, we've had, in short, we've had slight travelogue episodes. We've had some international intrigue and espionage via the Red Menace. He was also a little bit of a supervillain. And, you know, we're starting to establish that there's some of these prefabbed kind of templates that he's starting to recognize have utility. And here, he's mixing and matching. We start on a murder mystery, which is one kind of Shadow story, and we end on vast criminal conspiracy story, which is another kind of Shadow story, which is totally going to be a recurring element here in the Shadow magazine. So we open not only on a murder mystery, we open almost on like an Agatha Christie style murder mystery, where there's a bunch of different suspects. There's, Henry Marchand is the one who dies, but there's he has his personal physician there because he was ailing at the time, which kind of gives you the sense that whoever killed him was looking for plausible deniability. Maybe it was just a heart attack and all of the, you're setting up very much a Agatha Christie style. It is an Agatha Christie style kind of, has there been a murder sort of setup, which I find really interesting. But it's the subversion of his own formula that I think gets really interesting. Before his formula had even really got going, to be honest, Walter Gibson was still feeling his way through the prospect of writing these stories at this junction of his career. But there's a couple of different ways that he subverts this. The first, and one of the most ingenious ones, is the Shadow has spent almost every novel to this point. I don't think there has been a novel yet where the Shadow hasn't been in some kind of disguise. Including multiple ones. Like, usually he's not only in disguise, he's gonna try on more than one outfit. But here, the Shadow is disguised at one point as the Shadow. He's just a guy. He doesn't get a name. He doesn't get an identity. I find this absolutely fascinating, actually. The stranger just shows up at the house after the murder has already taken place. And mind you, this is after he's seen the cipher, because it wound up in police custody. And so the Shadow gets a hold of this cipher, but realizes he needs other information at a bare minimum. But he shows up disguised as what appears to be himself? It was not a sound that made Dr. Lukens raise his head. He was governed instead by one of those strange impulses that all human beings have felt. The mental impression that some other person is close at hand and watching. This influence became so strong in the mind of Dr. Lukens that he suddenly forgot the code, leaned back in his chair, and glanced to the right. Then he started in amazement. Seated beside the desk was a man clad in black. His figure seemed unaccountably dim in the gloomy light of the room. He was looking at Dr. Lukens, and the man's face was vividly strange. An exclamation of astonishment came from the physician as he surveyed the countenance of the visitor. It was smooth as parchment. It was mask-like in its expression. The eyes were obscured by large, heavy-rimmed spectacles, which were supplied with dark-tinted glass. Dr. Lukens had an impression that there were unusual eyes behind those glasses, that the stranger wore them to conceal the vivid sparkle of his eyes. "Who are you?" demanded the physician. "You would not know my name," replied the man in calm, even tones. "What are you doing here?" "I have come to see you." The stranger extended a long, black-clad arm, and his hand rested upon the code. "To see you about this. You're anxious to solve it, I believe." And I love this scene. I honestly think this is one of the best scenes in the whole book. And it's almost like a throwaway. And the Shadow's just putting two and two together. He's realizing he needs to be in the house. He finds this Dr. Lukens because he's been basically put in charge of sort of cleaning up the man's affairs after he's died. And he's at the desk where the man is murdered. And so they kind of go over this cipher and uncover probably the most brilliant subversion now of the Walter Gibson formula. What we have here is the first instance of a code left at the scene of the crime that seems significant, and maybe it has a secret message telling you the killer's identity. And it turns out that the Shadow puts two and two together and realizes, no, actually, this is completely meaningless. This is BS that's meant to throw us off the trail, and that's why it was left at the scene and not taken. "You seem perplexed," observed the stranger. "I do not wonder that you are. You have convinced yourself, as others have done also, that this paper bore a coded message. I do not blame the experts for their opinions. When they have tried every system known to themselves, they naturally assume that they have encountered something new." "But you did not assume that," returned Lukens. "No," replied the stranger, "because I am more confident of my ability. When I had studied the supposed code and subjected it to all my tests without a single clue, I knew there could be but one answer. The paper is a hoax." "What, then, is its purpose?" "To mislead, to arouse false theories, to accomplish the very thing which has been accomplished, to make people believe that Henry Marchant's death was an accident, when in reality it was a cleverly contrived murder." "A murder?" Lukens gripped the arms of the chair. "Speak softly," urged the stranger. "I am talking to you in confidence. I closed the door when I entered. We must be overheard by no one. The physician nodded. From there, the Shadow is off to the races. Of course, as I mentioned, we kind of have an Agatha Christiean sort of setup, so we have multiple suspects. We had, of course, the doctor who he's just treated with in his other guise, his guy who doesn't have a name but is quite transparently the Shadow, just not wearing a hat and wearing some sunglasses. And then we have Rodney Paget, who is a clubman and a bit of a ne'er-do-well, and you learn exactly how ne'er he wells, because he immediately kills Dr. Lukens after he discovers that Dr. Lukens is holding a memento from his recently deceased friend, and that memento is a scarab ring. This is what's kind of interesting. One little thread at a time, you're sort of revealing the core conceit, which is, of course, that there's this vast criminal organization that has almost like a cult-like aspect. With this ring, Rodney Paget is able to assume the identity of a member of the Silent Seven organization. And they have an extremely convoluted ritual by which you can actually sit down for a meeting with them, which I will now read, because this is fascinating Mysterioso stuff that Walter Gibson does so well. The room was small and barren. In one corner lay a dark mass of cloth. Paget stopped and lifted a dark blue robe topped by a cowl. He donned the garment and stepped to the wall opposite the spot where he had entered. He tapped the wall 7 times. A momentary silence, then 7 answering taps were heard. Paget tapped 5 times. A portion of the wall slid open. Paget entered a larger room where 4 cowled men were standing. One of them approached him. The room was filled with a dim, weird light. 7, came a whispered voice. The word was uttered by the cowled figure that stood before Paget. Silence, whispered Paget in reply. 1, came the next challenge. 5, was Paget's response. Our name, the Silent Seven. Our sign. Paget raised his hands to the front of his robe. The fingers of his right hand were spread. 2 fingers of his left hand were extended. The gesture signified the number 7. It satisfied the challenger. Our amulet, came the next request. Paget held out his left hand, palm down. There on his 3rd finger rested the scarab ring which had once been worn by Dr. George Lukens. The hooded challenger leaned forward to inspect it. He showed his approval by stepping backward. Paget, without noticeable hesitation, took his place near the wall beside the 3 hooded men who stood there. It's like almost a James Bondian kind of thing. It's like he's joined Spectre or something. Of course, this predates all of the James Bond stuff, but I love all this stuff. He essentially impersonates a member of the Silent Seven because they're not going to know his identity anyways, because they're so paranoid they don't want their identities to be known, because the Silent Seven are comprised of some of the most prominent society types, politicians, doctors, professors, nuclear physicists, presumably, just people from all strata of existence. And it's interesting, you get a little bit of lore here where the Silent Seven didn't just start out as some evil, they're not just some cabal or something. They actually started out with just a secret society that was perfectly noble, and gradually transmogrified into a perversion of their original purpose, which, would never happen in real life, right? Anytime there's no oversight and there's a secret society, nothing bad ever happens. What are you talking about? Rodney Paget, who, as we said, is quite the ne'er-do-well, is already heavily in debt, so he basically wants a score. It's essentially just a street criminal, a two-bit hood infiltrating this vast criminal organization, and he's looking to basically run a play on them. He knows they have vast financial resources, so he needs $10,000 from them in order to pull off an abduction of basically a longtime childhood friend who is now very, very affluent and successful. And to his amazement, they actually agree. I will not spoil the climax of this story because I highly recommend that you read it yourself. But what have I said time and time again? It has become a habitual occurrence. The best Shadow stories are the ones where the Shadow reverse engineers whatever evil device the villain is using to oppress the innocent, and he actually manages to turn it against them. We saw in the Voodoo Master, the Red Room that he uses to brainwash people, the Shadow used it to turn invisible and waylay his followers, right? The Hydra, we're going to talk about that later, one of my favorite stories. It's just again and again and again. He takes these devices and he turns them against their wielders. And I won't spoil a single thing about this, I promise. But he winds up, of course, the Shadow winds up triumphing, because that's just how it works. The Shadow never fails, in the immortal words of the Denny O'Neil comic from the 70s. The silly catchphrase that he invented. But it still applies here, and so he manages to prevail, and to no one's surprise, he uses a similar device to that which the criminals are using. Oh, this is such a well-written story. Some great atmosphere, great mystery. I love the scenes in the sort of sanctum sanctorum of the Silent Seven. You just get this, you could see this being in a movie or an Amazon series, and just sitting there as a viewer thinking, what the heck is going on? Like, what even is this? What is... And because this novelette just keeps you guessing. Interestingly, we probably should have included this in season 1 because there's a prominent first here. And that is that this is the first novelette in the Shadow series where the Shadow comes face to face and has an actual conversation and ultimately confrontation with Detective Joe Cardona. Joe Cardona, for those not aware, is kind of the Harvey Bullock figure of the Shadow, or, you know, it's really the reverse of that. We all know. But regardless, he's kind of the ace detective that the Shadow occasionally helps. He's portrayed as competent in his own right. He's not really portrayed as incompetent very often in the Shadow novels. He's actually more often than not portrayed as a guy who is essentially on the side of right and justice, does his best, and is very, very clever, but usually doesn't have access to all of the facts because he's not really operating in the same way that the Shadow is. You know, Joe Cardona's just a cop. The Shadow is a general in a actual long-term war campaign against crime. That's basically what he is. He is the Napoleon of the war on crime. So, of course, Joe Cardona doesn't have the same information. But this exchange is really interesting. It starts off with outright confrontation, and it ends with the Shadow divulging some very important information to Mr. Joe Cardona.
Cardona,
said the Shadow in a low, weird whisper.
I am not your enemy. I did not kill Dr. Lukens. I came here to protect him. Do you understand?
The detective nodded.
Your men have captured my weapons,
continued the Shadow in that same strange voice.
You will find that the bullet that killed this man does not correspond to either of my automatics. The murderer left here before I arrived. He has taken the gun with him.
Quietly, the Shadow stooped over the body of the dead physician. He opened Lukens's clenched right hand. The pair of dice dropped upon the floor. They showed the number 7, a 5 spot and a 2.
There is a connection,
said the Shadow, rising.
Those dice were in Marchand's desk. This murder, like Marchand's death, has something to do with the number 7. Perhaps some fiend has planned 7 murders. Perhaps.
His voice was thoughtful.
There are 7 persons involved. Follow that clue. Seek the murderer. I shall tell you more. The gun was probably fitted with a silencer. That extended finger of Lucans's left hand shows a purpose. The murderer desired a ring that he was wearing. Seek the murderer.
The Shadow's voice was sibilant.
And I shall aid you. Premeditated murder with Dr. Lucans taken unaware. I shall aid you. When I am certain of the murderer's identity and have fathomed the plans of his associates, I shall reveal them to you.
Cardona saw the flash of two burning eyes that peered from the depths below the broad-brimmed hat. He clutched the arms of his chair to fight off dizziness. Then, the Shadow was gone. Outside, the two plainclothes men were returning from their fruitless pursuit. They were startled by the sound of a long, taunting laugh that seemed to come from nowhere and that dwindled away to a mysterious nothingness. It was the laugh of the Shadow. Agents of the Shadowcast, needless to say, you must read The Silent Seven. It is the sequel, essentially, to The Death Tower, which is also a must-read, and I would argue it's just as good as the first story. I might even like the premise of it. It might just edge it out a little bit because I like the premise just a little bit more, although it doesn't have quite as maniacal a villain as the demented Dr. Palermo with his lobotomies on still living patients and so forth. Nice guy. Really nice guy. Folks, this has been an extra long episode, but I think you would agree with that long interview and this review of one of the finest shadow pulps of the classic period, that the extra length was worth it. Until we return next time.
As you sow evil, so shall you reap evil. Crime does not pay. The Shadow knows.